My name is Steve Cohen. I'm Executive Director of Columbia's Earth Institute and a professor at the School of International and Public Affairs here at Columbia University. I'm also the director, I have a lot of titles, of the Earth Institute's research program on sustainability policy and management. And we are the host this evening, and I'm pleased to welcome you to an event on sustainability measurement in China, fostering a race to the top. Sustainability is now widely recognized as an essential component for development in China, and the Chinese government has set ambitious environmental and social targets. Perhaps we could do that here in the United States at some point. But the sheer pace of China's economic growth makes establishing a sustainable development strategy a really challenging task. In order to seriously assess progress, it's important to have a standardized, localized system to measure and manage sustainability. The need for such measurement was first expressed by the great management scholar Peter Drucker when he said, if you can't measure something, you can't manage that. Generations of public management students here at Columbia have heard me say the same exact thing. Because without measurement, you can't tell if what you're doing as a manager is making things better or worse. And so measurement is critical. To meet the need for sustainability measurement, the research program that I direct has recently released the China Sustainable Development Indicator System, a new sustainability measurement framework and annual ranking of the sustainability performance of Chinese cities. You'll learn more about this shortly. We held the first launch of this project in Beijing last month with our research partner, the China Center for International Economic Exchanges, a leading economic policy think tank in China. And we're happy you can all be here tonight for our first presentation of this same information to a U.S. audience. I think we'll be using a different language than the one they used in China as well. At least that's my hope. The first published rankings of this project represent an important output of 3 years of collaborative work between the research program here and our China research partners. And we see it as an important contribution to promoting healthy and sustainable development of the Chinese economy, and hope it will provide a unique example and model for other countries, perhaps even our own. This project recognizes the importance of advancing sustainability in China, complements decision-making in public policy, and also contributes to the research program's broader research on sustainability metrics and sustainability management itself. Tonight, we have a panel of experts who will explore the importance of such standardized systems to assess sustainability at the local level, as well as the value of measuring a broad set of indicators to encourage cities to race to the top in sustainability performance. Traditionally, cities in China have focused on GDP growth alone. With these indicators, we add another very important dimension to quality of life, that of sustainability. This panelists will discuss how these systems can complement policymaking in China's local administrative system, the balance between the state and the private sector, and how we can encourage investment in and adoption of these new sustainability metric systems. I'd now like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Dong Gua, who teaches economics in our MPA in Environmental Science Policy program at SEPA, and serves as an associate research scholar at the Earth Institute, and he's also director of the Earth Institute's China Initiative. He's following my tradition of having as many titles as possible. He's going to share more about our work and set the stage for what I know will be an exciting panel discussion. Dr. Gua is an important member of our research team. His expertise lies in impact and evaluation methods. In addition to sustainability measurement, he's currently working on evaluation of sustainability programs, research on environmental awareness and perception, and is expanding our work in China. He's also co-authoring a book with tonight's moderator. It's a book on sustainability finance and our moderator, Professor Bose, who is also a close colleague of mine as well. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Gua to the podium.
Thank you, Steve. Thank you, everyone. I really like this room with all the Chinese artifacts, how appropriate. I actually heard from someone on some of those pots with the Chinese characters, each of those characters is worth 2,000 US dollars, and they have tons of them on some of the pots. They're not really called pots, but a lot of them are really, really valuable. I actually have a lot of slides here, but I'll try to go through them rather quickly so we leave more time for discussions on some of the details. I just want to provide you with the context of the kind of work that we actually did in this project. Steve mentioned how measurement is really important to sustainability or environmental management. I was actually just in China last month with Satyajit. The Chinese government effectively closed down 40% of Chinese factories for December and November of last year. And they fined 80,000 Chinese factories for emitting over their allotted limits. They did all that because the government is about to miss their 2013 targets, emission targets that was stipulated in 2013. So they have to do that. Obviously, that's very economically efficient. But they had to do that, really rush toward the end to make sure they do not go over the lines for the emissions. So that's really the reason why that we need a measurement system, a standardized system of measurement that can guide the local governments especially towards a more sustainable path, a model of development that moves away from just depending solely on the GDP or economic related indicators. And also aggregated all these indicators towards a composite indicator, effectively an index that ranks 70 medium-sized and above cities in China. So the indicator system is there to complement decision-making process, and then the single indicator, the index, or the composite indicator, is more transparent, easier to understand. So that's really used to encourage public participation, to encourage public understanding, awareness of environmental issues, so that the public knows how their cities are performing, so that they can hold their government officials accountable for their words. We can talk about some of these details in how we come up with indicators, how they're selected and aggregated, especially how they're weighted. This is actually a system that's a little bit different from some of the systemic indicator system that you see elsewhere in the world, and also in China. We thought ours are probably more scientific in the way that we designed it. So based on the 2016 ranking, that's the most recent that we have, the coastal cities, well, you can see that the bigger the dots, the more sustainable they are, or the higher their rankings. The coastal cities rank high in overall sustainability. Obviously, they're the most economically advanced cities, and they have better environmental quality as they're on the seaboards. And then, as we move inland, the cities in central and western China, ranks relatively lower on the list. They're not as economically advanced. They're catching up, but they're still not there as some of the coastal cities. And they face greater environmental degradation, a lot of problems with the more recent industrialization that those cities are undertaking. These are the top 10 cities in our ranking from 2013 to 2016. You can see it's actually quite stable, apart from Wuhan, the city of Wuhan, the capital city of Hubei province, rise from 15 in 2013 to 2016. The other cities sort of within the top 10 for the 4-year period that we have data on. And Shenzhen and Guangzhou are the two neighboring cities in Guangdong province. They're always competing on different things. And now you can see that even on sustainability performance, they're quite similar. We actually were asked by the Shenzhen TV station, specifically about their competition with Guangzhou and how they're doing better than their close competitor. This is a list of all the cities that we have in our ranking for 2016. I know it's probably a bit too small for some of you at the back, but Shenzhen, Guangzhou, some of the major cities at the top, and then Pingdingshan, Jinzhou, those that constantly touted in the media for their poor air quality, tend to rank really lower down the rankings. We're going to try to incorporate more cities into our ranking for the next iteration. Hopefully we'll put in 30 more cities so we get 100. One of the frequent comment when we did this presentation in China was, where Suzhou is actually the economic leading city in Jiangsu province, and that was missed in our ranking. So we're going to try to incorporate some more cities into the next version. So this graph, it's a little bit difficult to read. The bottom of the bar actually represents the highest ranked category. And the top of the bar indicates the lowest ranked category. The first city, which is the #1 ranked city, Shenzhen, you can see that the top of the bar is about at 66, and the lower end is at 1. So for Shenzhen, what that means is it performed really, really well on environmental emissions and consumptions, and also environmental management. But it performed really poorly on the social welfare component. We had 5 components in our system, so we sort of did really well on a couple categories and really poorly on one of the other categories. So you can see even the most sustainable city in our system did not experience a very balanced development path. So that's really a major problem. Even the better performing cities on sustainable development still have to do work on balancing their growth components. This is something I want to show you, the economic development versus sustainable development. As the Chinese central government especially try to move away from a GDP-dependent growth model. There's a lot of pushback. There's a lot of, especially local government agencies are trying to say, do we just ignore economic development? But here it shows actually if we ranked all of the cities by per capita GDP and correlate that with the their sustainable development rankings, they're actually quite related. The Spearman's rank correlation coefficient shows that they're 86% related. The rankings on economic development measured by per capita GDP and the ranking on sustainable development measured by our system, the two are quite related. So it's not to say that you want to grow more sustainably, you just have to give up economic growth. And that's something that's frequently talked about in China. There's a lot of debate about that, whether the economy still needs to be an emphasis. Just last week, one of the top Chinese officials went to Davos to represent China and gave a speech. The top 3 priorities, for the next few years for the Chinese central government is, to control the systemic financial risks in the financial sector. The second is poverty alleviation, and the third is environmental protection. Nowhere to be seen is economic development. Where in the past it used to be growth, and growth, right? So it's a big shift, but it had also a lot of people worry that the government go a step too far and just forget about economic growth, which you can see from here at least, and that's really not the right strategy. And then we have the top cities ranked by each of the 5 components on economic development, our #1 category. You can see most of the cities that ranked high on economic development are again in the coastal regions. This is no surprise, but then if we looked at the rankings on social welfare and livelihood, almost all of the cities that were on the previous list are not here anymore. The assumption is that if you have more economic development, you have more resources at your disposal, you can spend a lot of those resources on social welfare, right? And building a better safety network for your residents. But that's really not the case. It tends to be the inland cities which do better, much better on social welfare. We can discuss some of the reasons for this later. And for environmental resources, there's no surprise here. It's really the cities in the southern part of China which tend to have a better environment and better endowed with environmental resources. Consumption emissions, it's the population centers. The major cities with the most population tend to use most of the energy, most of the natural resources endowed with. So these are the population centers tend to rank high on consumption emissions. Lastly, on environmental management, it's really the cities that have done traditionally poorly on, for example, air pollution. I came from Zhengzhou, and then Shijiazhuang, some of the cities which are really, really poor in terms of their air quality. But the governments there are putting a lot of effort to reverse that trend, try to correct for that problem. So that's why on the management component, some of these cities, which are traditionally known for bad air quality, have done pretty well. But there's still a lot of work to be done. The next few slides, I just want to run through them to show what's contained on our website and in our report, some of the things that we also did. The case studies. We did case studies for each of the 70 cities in our ranking. Basically, we have their overall rankings and their best performing indicators, the worst performing indicators, and their trend in their performance over the past four years. And you can see these are indicators, rankings for the city of Shenzhen. A lot of the indicators ranked number 1 for Shenzhen, but they also have done a little poorly on, for example, education expenditure, on health expenditure, on some of the and housing affordability indicator, and congestion, some of the the big city syndrome, so to speak. And we have the city rankings by all the 22 indicators that we have in our system. This is just an example, the housing to income ratio. There's no surprise here, the cities that rank the lowest, which means that they have the highest housing prices as compared to the disposable income of their residents. Those cities are Sanya, Shanghai, Beijing, Wenzhou. Those are some of the most expensive places to live in. Lastly, we have comparisons with international cities. Comparisons across boundaries is always difficult. We talk about the physical dimensions of the environment. That's probably easier to compare with. But then if we start to talk about the management component or the social component, it's going to be very, very difficult to bring the same system into some other countries. So when we compare the economic development using GDP growth rate, it's obvious that the Chinese cities are performing relatively well compared to some of the international cities. On service sector, especially compared with advanced economies, they still need a lot of improvement in terms of their the contribution from the tertiary sector. Environmental resources, China is sort of known as a country that is not well endowed with natural resources, so you tend to rank relatively low on environmental resources with international cities. Consumption emissions, obviously still going through industrialization. A lot of cities are still have a lot of heavy industries, so the use of energy, the use of natural resources is still not as efficient as some of the other cities in more developed countries. So that's it. We can develop, we can try to spend more time discussing some of the details later in our panel. But for more information, feel free to visit our website. We actually developed a very dedicated website just for this project, together with our partner CCIE. It's urbansustainability.org. Okay. I'll take questions, but maybe after our panel discussion. So let me now just introduce our moderator, my colleague, Dr. Satyajit Bose. Dr. Bose is a lecturer here at Columbia University and Associate Director of the Master of Science in Sustainability Management program. He teaches courses on the economics of sustainability, green accounting, cost and benefit analysis. He's also Associate Director of the Research Program on Sustainability Policy and Management, which I'm part of, and co-chaired the University Seminar in Sustainable Finance. He holds a BA and PhD in economics from Columbia and has extensive expertise in investment banking, asset management, and impact measurement. He has led several projects on environmental performance metrics for our research program, and is currently co-authoring a book with me on the use of green accounting and sustainable finance metrics by businesses and governments. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Bose.
Thank you, Professor Guo, for sticking to the script when you introduced me. We worked closely together for many years, and he knows a lot of things about me which I wouldn't want him to tell you. So So, we gave him a script. I have the enviable job of introducing our remaining speakers on the panel. I'd like to introduce to you Jonathan Krane, who I only met in person today, but we've spoken on the phone a number of times. Jonathan Krane is the founder and CEO of KraneShares, which is an investment management company based in New York, but that is entirely focused on China. And in particular, KraneShares' mission is to make available investment opportunities for ordinary investors around the world, as well as institutional investors, the ability to invest in domestic Chinese companies which are listed as A shares. And he's going to tell you more about that. And in particular, KraneShares has exchange-traded funds, ETFs, which are comprised of A shares more broadly within China, but also they have ETFs that focus on the environmental sector in China, as well as the infrastructure sector. I think they have a ETF whose ticker might be OBOR for One Belt, One Road. Jonathan's been working for 15 years in China. He's always there. He knows it very well. And maybe in our panel, he'll also tell you about a small, somewhat secret new venture that he's working on, which involves making significant impact, creating jobs, reducing carbon emissions, and also growing very quickly, all of those in one thing. So Jonathan, if you would come up and sit down. And our next expert that we'd like to invite to the panel is Professor Weiping Wu, who I only met in person today, but I had heard her last year. She recently wrote a book. This is the book called The Chinese City. And I bought it last year, and you can see, when I hold it like this, it sort of flaps open. This is an indication of how much I read it. So I know that I have some students here. You know that I always check to see how thumbed through your textbooks are. So next time you come to class, please thumb through your textbook. Okay, so Professor Wu is a professor of urban planning at Columbia's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning and Preservation. She's also the director of the Master of Science in Urban Planning program. She came to us a couple of years ago from Tufts University, and she is really an expert, or has chosen to devote her current research interests on the dynamics of cities as they globalize. And in some of the discussions for this panel, she has asked us very searching questions about the way in which the metrics of sustainability that we came up with, how they change over time and what happens as sustainable development occurs. One of the things that I learned from her book, for example, is that there are tens of thousands of environmental protests in China every year, which is a very interesting aspect for Professor Guo and I to think about as we were focused on the numbers and the management of the metrics. It's nice to know that also, while the metrics are important and we're doing statistical analysis with them, there are people who care sufficiently about it to come out and protest about specific environmental things. So, Professor Wu, please come and join us. So I have the easy job of asking a bunch of tough questions to the crowd here. We've got about 35 minutes. I'll ask them some questions. Hopefully we'll have some discussion, and I'll reserve about 5 minutes at the end for Q&A. or more if it looks like people are protesting and wanting to ask questions. Okay, so maybe I'll throw out one question for everyone, which is, to what extent do you think that sustainable development at the local level in quite varied surroundings in China, to what extent can that development be measured using metrics with a portfolio of indicators that essentially puts them all in the same bucket? Does it make sense, for example, to measure the alternatives to economic growth, the ways in which we might contribute to sustainability for different cities? Should they be measured in the same way? We have this similar kind of problem when we think about companies. I'm very used to financial assessment of companies, and in that, it's very common to try to rank companies based on a single metric, like return on equity or price to earnings performance. But actually, companies differ in how they do well, and a multiplicity of metrics are important. So maybe Jonathan, Professor Wu, Dong, you can talk to us a little bit about that. And also, please feel free to introduce yourself and tell us any stories that I wasn't able to tell about you as you start.
Okay. Yeah. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having me here today. My name's Jonathan Krane. I have a ETF company, asset management company that's focused on China, and we see a lot of opportunity in the China market, especially helping U.S. and global investors access China. In fact, China today is the second largest equity market in the world between the Shanghai and Shenzhen exchanges, but actually about 1% of global investors own that market. So it's been a closed market. And what's happening actually this year is, for the first time, China and really the A-share market, that's the Shenzhen and Shanghai exchanges, will be included in global indexes. And that's significant, and it will tie back into what's happening there with environmental companies actually too, where when I say China's going to be included in global indexes for the first time, it means that global investors will have to start buying China because it's going to be in indexes. And you have significant asset flows that will start going into these markets, the A-share markets. And it will be starting June 1st, MSCI, which is really a leading institutional index, will start including China in their MSCI Emerging Market Index, and it will be about 20% of that index. So about $400 billion US will have to flow into the China markets. It's one of the largest asset flows, rebalances of portfolios in the history of asset management. And why that's significant is that there's a lot of Chinese companies that are listed on the Shenzhen and Shanghai exchanges that are focused in all different areas, but a lot of it is technology and in the environment. So I think this is going to really help these Chinese local A-share companies, as global investors will be able to start buying them. And so I think that's something significant that will be happening. And just to answer your question about the cities, so what we're finding out, I think it's incredible that this index has been built, and sort of it will focus a lot of cities on sort of their ratings and their where they fit into the how they compare to other cities. So it makes it competitive in a good way, because you want, obviously, the mayors of these cities want to be high on that list. But what we're also hearing is that the mayors across China now, they're being told by the central government that their number one criteria that they're going to be rated by or judged by is carbon levels, which is very interesting. They're also being told that they can sacrifice GDP, okay, and that's really shutting down factories that are polluting. And what I think that will trigger is, obviously that's positive, because it's something that immediately touches all Chinese citizens, is the air quality. But I think what will happen is, as you focus on lowering the carbon levels, and maybe that you have to close some of your manufacturing, and what happens is you focus on creating new industries. And those new industries are going to be green related or environmentally friendly related. And we're seeing new development zones across China that are being created by cities that they're providing land and financing for any company that's focused on sustainable development, on green development and lowering carbon. So there's it's incredible focus now across China on creating new industries that are going to help the environment. And so that's all going to start happening. It is happening, and we think that China is going to really take a lead globally in alternative and clean tech, really, and will be a model. And so we actually have created a fund that's listed on the New York Stock Exchange that focuses on the China environment. And ESG has become a very kind of buzzword out there in the investment community, but we kind of focused on the E of ESG, which is environment. And there's a lot of great Chinese companies that are now growing quickly because of the policy happening in China, and a lot of focus and investment going into that sector. We see, I believe China will take that leadership position, and the world will benefit from that. Thanks.
So I'm really pleased to be involved in this discussion, as Professor Bose was saying, that I teach about Chinese urbanization and urbanism in the architecture school. And this effort, I really applaud it, and especially for two reasons. First is the message is right, and it's an important message that growth is not the only indicator of progress, and the environment and other sustainability aspects are important. And this is particularly true because China, although its territory is very similar to that of US, it faces very different kind of human environmental pressure and stress, particularly in some areas of the country. So its undoing or potential undoing, if any, will not likely stem from sort of the slowing down of the economy and so on. It will be, and most scholars agree, it will be from the environmental impacts and externalities that the growth causes. So I think the message is really important. And hence, I believe, the index, the matrix are very good source of incentives for cities and local governments to move forward. Second, I think it's important because China also is very different from many other countries we look to around, the Western Hemisphere. If you look at the United States, when we started talking about sustainability, we were already rich. China is trying to get clean before it gets rich. It may never get as rich as US. And so it really could represent a different paradigm in where, we all know about the Kuznets curve, right? Sustainability in development. Do we really need to hold that? Do we really have to wait until income levels reach certain, degree that we begin to pay attention to the other indicators of development? So I think this index, brings us to that stage to really try to explore that different paradigm, and it will have significant implications for other emerging markets and economies, and particularly those countries along the One Belt and One Road. So I think, I really applaud your efforts, at least for those two reasons.
Thank you, Professor Wu.
Just one thing I'd like to add, just in answering that question. We sort of released our ranking system on the 19th of December, that's last month. And then on the 25th, the Chinese National Bureau of Statistics, together with the Ministry of Environmental Protection and the Reform and Development Commission, they got together in a partnership a few years ago and then came up with the Eco-Development Index, which really just solely focuses on the physical dimensions of sustainability. And again, they're just measuring the performances of provinces, not in particular cities. So it does not really contradict with our work. But you can see the government organizations in China has already started that effort in coming up with measurement tools to complement their decision-making process. I mean, if you have the GDP indicators or some of the other economic indicators been there for 30 years past to guide the development of China, mostly economic development, you can certainly have a range of at least the physical environmental indicators to guide it towards more sustainable paths. So, I think there's no doubt that indicators, measurement systems, or, the governments frequently talk about coming up with a comprehensive evaluation system, a new way of evaluating the performance of local officials based on sustainable criteria rather than just economic indicators. So I think it's definitely possible, and they're actually doing that already. So we see a lot of progress in that space.
So maybe to push a little bit on the question of multiple indicators versus a single one. If I'm managing a local government and I've spent the last 20 years thinking about GDP growth, and I know how to do that, and I've worked out ways in which we can achieve that. Now you come and tell me that I should focus on 21 other indicators. That complicates my job. And does it make it harder or easier? And isn't there some pushback that would be natural?
Well, I mean, it depends, right? I mean, if we're talking about the government officials, it was much easier to deal just with the single economic indicator. But then it's probably the competition is going to be more fierce with just one indicator. And to me personally, I sort of believe in the cause and effect, right? I mean, I believe if we really look at the cause and effect, then there's always an origin. So there may be just one indicator, that's everything. For example, biodiversity. There's a lot of study on that, and seeing that indicator may be the sort of all-encompassing indicator that's connected to all. But practically, that single indicator is going to be very, very difficult to find. So before we achieve that, I think a bigger set of indicators that guide the bigger discussion going to be the only possible way that we have. We, even when we envisioned our project, a constant theme is to have a parsimonious set of indicators. So we're always looking to reduce the number of indicators, so they're not as complicated. We started off actually with 700 plus indicators in the 5 components, and we narrowed it down to 22. So that's remarkable already. So. We believe in simplicity, but it's, for practical reasons, I think you have to, start somewhere. I think 20-something is not that big a set, given the complexity of the situation that we face today. But we may eventually move into, just a few indicators that can really guide this discussion, like we had with economic indicators in the economic development space.
Yeah, just one comment. I mean, I think all these indicators are important for the success of a city long term and the happiness of citizens in that city. But I think short term, where the government, the one indicator the government's very focused on is carbon levels, because pollution is there every day, and that's what triggers the most complaints from citizens of China. So lowering carbon, I think, is in that indicator is a way to show that there's progress and improvement, and I think that's what the government's focused on. Longer term, obviously, China, which is very interesting, over the last really 10 years, has really focused on moving away from being a manufacturing country. and being dependent on exports to really focused on urbanization, people moving to cities, making more money, and domestic consumption. So they're really focused on within now. But through that domestic consumption and middle classes forming and people making more money and buying goods and, and really sort of this whole consumerism and upgrading of consumerism, you then create new problems, which is you have a lot of old cars or old refrigerators, or, and lots of them. And so you have to then focus on recycling. And what do you do with all this? And so I think all of that is being looked at now, and companies are starting around those type of opportunities. So it's I think China's doing a great job also, and the technology development is incredible there, and they've been working on this for years. Where I know we've mentioned the Belt and Road Initiative, which is China investing $6 to $8 trillion across 70 countries and rebuilding and modernizing the Silk Road, the original Silk Road. So it's China through Kazakhstan, Russia, India, Southeast Asia, into Africa, and then into Europe. That's starting now, and the result of that is you're going to have these new modern trade routes, both by land and also with high-speed rail, and also by sea with all these modernized ports. And so what you'll see also is, China with developing incredible technology and engineering that they've basically, throughout China now, you have the most high-speed rail tracks in the world. You have modernized ports, the most beautiful, well-engineered bridges. And I think what now that expertise has been developed over the last 20 years, and they've proven it out in China in a very fast way, where they're ready to export that technology and that know-how now across 70 countries. And so, again, I think China's going to take a leadership role in establishing the clean technology and sustainable environment companies in China, and they'll export those also across the world. So lots going on.
Professor Wu, actually wanted to pull you in for this discussion. No, it's good. Because one thing with the One Belt, One Road initiative, and another concern of ours in designing this is to what extent are older cities, like Xi'an, how is it different from, say, Shenzhen, or cities on the Western China, how are they different in trying to achieve this? In your book, you talk a lot about the different historical context of urban development for these different cities. Is it much easier for Shenzhen to be number one than for Xi'an or Kaifeng or something like that? And how does One Belt, One Road help in that process?
Yeah. So, I also had a couple of thoughts to go with the earlier question, and would all kind of integrate together. And I think, when you look at China, there are a couple of things you want to really think about. One is, it is a very different type of political system. In fact, your question about whether, having more indicators, is it, more feasible? It is very much what we call a developmentalist state. And if you look at the current regime under Xi Jinping, it's very clear it is not going to be any different from a sort of a top-down process. And so the accountability system is very much local officials, not just to the people, which you all mentioned, but it really is also, there is a possibility of a strong political will at the central level and really enforce at the local level. So it's actually, in a sense, advantageous for pushing for a more progressive agenda. And that said, which also could play to a less advantageous role for some of the cities, the older cities and the cities in the interior. Because if you look at the last 3 decades or so, the investment, the policy incentives have really favored the coastal cities, have really favored the larger cities. And of course, this new One Belt, One Road, in a way, could balance off some of the disparities that has been persisting in the country for centuries. However, if you look at the Go West program that was just about 2 decades ago, the impact was limited. Of course, Go One Belt One Road is much more ambitious, and if the investment and resources, where you put your money where your mouth is, I think it will make significant dent into overcoming some of the disparities. But the challenge is really quite steep in terms of how some of the inland cities are quite lagging behind, and that's why I was a little bit surprised by, on one set of indicators, the inland cities fare that well. And so that's a really interesting opportunity to explore how these cities could, look at, alternative path of development. And the second point has a little bit to do with my early point of China potentially setting a new paradigm. And, Professor Bose and all of your work really, in a way, points to the need that when we look at index, we are also sending a strong message. What is the kind of sustainable development cities can afford, really, to undergo? So I was looking at some of the indicators, for instance, per capita road area. The more isn't the better, and China, particularly given the significant constraint in per capita arable land in terms of food security issues, it really cannot afford to develop in the same patterns, the leapfrogging, sprawling types of land development that the West has seen, particularly North America has seen. And so this is an opportunity to really maybe think about indicators that really are based on sustainability principles and really are about conserving sort of the green agenda that is really not just treating the waste, but also to proactively conserve resources. So I think that is, sort of in a sense, based on the context of China's urbanization, a great opportunity for this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that perhaps you could all talk about is the extent to which our need to use consistent metrics across cities led to imperfect signals. So, for example, the per capita road area was an attempt to get to congestion. And unfortunately, we didn't have traffic data for all those cities, and we ended up looking at a bunch of different metrics, and this was the one that came closest for the few cities for which we had both of that data. And I know, Jonathan, you and I talked a little bit about this venture that hopefully you'll tell us a little bit about. One of the metrics that's often used for sustainable development is the amount of trees per acre, but sometimes even that's not a good enough metric because, for example, the species of tree matters and whether you have a monoculture and so on.
Yeah, thanks a lot. We're also, I'll mention, we're involved in a venture in China that's focused on urban forestry. And that plays into everything that we're talking about today, where you have cities with urbanization. I think China this year went over 50% or 55% urban. When you have 1.4 billion people, that's more people now living in cities than in the country, and they want that number to go to 80%. So you have this trajectory of hundreds of millions of more people moving to cities. And so, if you're looking into the future, how do you create healthy environments in these cities? And we believe urban forestry is a very important part of that, and trees, but not just, there's a lot of trees in China, but healthy trees. And so this venture focuses on creating urban nurseries that with very good technology from around the world about best practices of growing healthy trees. And then these trees, really creating a new industry, and that's what I kind of talked about before, where you're now producing long-term a supply of healthy trees into a city ongoingly, and creating a lot of jobs and industry around that, lowering carbon, and really having an interesting and powerful return on that investment, where you can provide data where you have numbers of trees and how that's lowering carbon, helping stormwater, and other opportunities with beautification. And so we're now, it's early stages of this company, but we're rolling it out in a few pilot cities and building out these nurseries. The interesting part of it, not just from the business side, but just many cities are calling saying, we want that. And it just shows the eagerness that I think the Chinese government has done a good job saying this is important. And so a lot of the mayors say we want to bring this initiative into our city and show the central government we're doing something here, and looking for results around that.
Professor Wu, one of the things that we talked about and that you taught us a little bit about is the role of the migrant workers in all these cities and the differential impact they have on the different types of cities, and perhaps how that might be connected to the different achievements on the social welfare. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. When Dong was showing some of these indicators of social welfare and some of the, so I learned from him that some of the coastal large cities didn't fare as well, partially because the migrants were actually factored in the calculation, which is really a really important thing to do. And as you mentioned, that migrants, are in this very precarious situation. Many of them, especially in large cities. I think, in smaller cities, and particularly inland, mid-sized smaller cities, migrants actually have roughly a similar set of access to amenities and benefits. But in large cities, they continue to be on the periphery, both in terms of truly, where they live spatially, as well as, sort of in terms of the benefits they have access to, their children have access to, and so on. So I think this is a really critical national conversation that China has had and continue to have, and it hasn't really reached a very satisfactory stage in terms of allowing migrants to either have the same kind of access in cities, particularly in large cities, or allow them to sell off, let's say, or transfer their land back home, which is a form of social security for them, so that they have some capital to really kind of explore small business opportunities in cities and so on. So it's really a critical issue for Chinese. And if you look at the protests, in addition to the kind of environmental protests, you have many protests in China today are about land grabs. By cities, and then victims being the villagers. And so I don't think, in this case that we have a good solution to suggest, but to really show the fact that when migrants factor into the big cities, the cities have this really pressing need to consider how investment resources have to go in. Of course, that in a way is not just a local issue, because migrants are regional and national, and there has to be a transfer system, of physical resources in China that allow bigger cities that accommodate many millions of migrants to have some resources to do so. And that is now spelled out partially in the new urbanization plan, but really only applies to third and fourth tier cities in China in terms of that fiscal transfer. So the large cities continue to be very restrictive in terms of allowing migrants sort of that permanent foothold in the cities. And so fundamentally, China needs to consider a reform of the household registration system. But perhaps even more fundamentally is to disassociate that system with access to social welfare. And so those are very large agenda items, but I think the current leadership, as you mentioned in the Davos, I think it's you, right? Mentioned in the Davos that meetings that poverty and inequality have come to the top of the agenda, and so for that I remain quite optimistic.
So, bringing in Professor Gould, because you've had an easy time so far, can you tell us a little bit about the underlying philosophy of the weighting system, and how did you decide to put 5 categories of 5 indicators in one category and 10 indicators in another, and so on?
Right. Well, I mean, this indicator system sort of started with Steve's vision that we need a standardized sustainability agreed upon set of sustainability indicators similar to sort of the counting principles that we started to have since the Great Depression. We started with the physical dimensions of the environment, that's the environmental stock and flow. So that's basically in our system the environmental emissions and consumptions, and then the environmental resources. So we started with those, and then the economic dimension is one that has a lot of indicators that already have a lot of consensus. So that one was easy to add. And then if we look at the UN system, with the Sustainable Development Goals, they have a lot of social and governance indicators. So it's by the suggestion of our partner in China, they want to, their system to be somewhat comparable to the ones at the supranational level. So that's how we came up with the 5 dimensions. When I said during my presentation that our system, especially the weighting strategy, to which Satyajit is actually the architect here, it follows a very rigorous statistical method. That's what it differs from some of the other sustainable development systems. So when we designed the weighting, we sort of took into account the temporal and spatial volatilities of the indicators. Say if an indicator that moves dramatically from year to year, and then we tend to assign that indicator with smaller weight. Because that tends to suggest that there's a lot of data issues. For example, one of the indicators that has the lowest weights in our system, the household waste harmless treatment rate. If you look at the system, go to our website, look at the weighting for this indicator, it probably have a 1.39 type of weighting. The reason for that is if you look at a lot of the cities on this indicator, 1 year it's 50%, and then the next year it's 100%. And not only that, the year after that, it's down back to 50% again. So you can argue in the second year there's a change in standard maybe, but then what happened in the third year? So there's a lot of that going on, as we try to clean all the data. So we decided to assign the weights according to the volatilities of each of the indicators. So hopefully that smooths it out a little bit.
Yeah, just also commenting on ESG, environmental social governance, which has become very popular in global investing, and really all institutions, endowments have now made part of their portfolios, at least a slice of ESG focused strategies. And I think the index that has been created in China is an amazing start in rating the cities. But I also think the next step can be ESG around companies and the corporations, where you start rating companies and really highlighting who's trying to help the environment and is behaving out there and who's not. And I think that will be the next step, where you start seeing ESG ratings around the corporations in China.
Could I just make a quick suggestion in terms, because we talked about the road density in space earlier, to perhaps look at more transit indicators, investment, transit. We talked about the high-speed rail. Yeah. But Chinese cities are just, we go there and we know, I never drive. I've never driven in China. I'm afraid to also, but I don't have to, right? I have choices of metro, I have choices of buses, occasionally I take taxis. It's a place where, the transit integration is so advanced, right? You go to Shanghai, you go to Hongqiao, you get on anything, everything. And so I think that could be a way of really promoting this sort of more sustainable way of mobility.
Right, we sort of did look at that as an indicator in the provincial system. It's like, in the city indicators, it's a little bit difficult, but, with high-speed rail, probably it goes from region to region. So in the province indicators, maybe that's one that we should really look hard to incorporate. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I have another little question about, because we talked a little bit about manufacturing. I feel a little bit differently, and we know in this country how we feel about the loss of manufacturing. And this whole sort of movement towards pushing out manufacturing, both in the entire country as well as some of the key cities. So if you look at Beijing, the environment has improved, but where did the industries go? They went to Hebei. I mean, the province look is terrible, right? So that externality, so I think, some of the indicators also sort of suggest this sort of preference for service sector. I really hope we can think about that. I mean, with so many people and such a large labor force, what's really more sustainable in terms of both in environmental progress, but also people's livelihood, right? And when the state, the SOE sector, the state sector went through restructuring in the 90s, there was just an army of furloughed workers in the cities who really didn't have much prospect moving forward. And the same with the migrants, right? And so, again, I think China represents a different paradigm, and the solutions ought to also be different.
Yeah, and so I think that's a very interesting and provocative question. So instead of trying to answer that, we're out of time, and I do want to give people a little bit of a chance to ask questions. So we're going to have 3 minutes for a couple of questions from the audience. And I know that the questioners are holding us up from the wine and cheese and the informal discussion, so we'll limit it to that. Do we have some mics? Yes. So the gentleman who has his hand raised with the beard.
Please pass. First, thank you guys for your insights. My question is in regards to the sustainability index. Do you guys have a consideration for the environmental footprint associated with the food consumed in those cities?
No, not really. I mean, to have data, data availability is really the biggest issue here. You see some other indicator system that they release rankings on 100+ cities, but it's not really a scientific approach. They just really, go by what's available. We want to make sure that indicators that we select are the ones that really represents our vision of sustainable development. And then we have to make sure those indicators are also available, like the one that I talked about on the harmless treatment rate. Although there's a lot of data issue, we still think that's an important indicator to have in the picture. So hopefully the government can look at that and try to improve upon it.
Yeah, I agree in regards to food. Is there anything that you guys would look for to be measured, like as we move into like the blockchain era and the Internet of Things? Like what type of sensors and data do you think we should try to capture in order to make sustainability evaluations around food production?
That's probably too specific, to look at this point. Like our categories, if you look at our system, is still quite broad at this stage. Even at the very broad level, it's hard enough to get consensus, right? If you talk about the social component or the governance component. So it's going to be incredibly more difficult if you look at some of the more specific areas and then try to make sure that, the cities in different regions, they may not face the same issues, all agree on the same indicator.
Okay, I think we had one more question here. Gentleman with the white, blue shirt. Here's a mic.
Leading from that, I'm amazed at the intricacy of this measure, and I wanted to ask specifically, I'm amazed that the data is available, and then my next question would be the reliability of the data that's going into this.
Well, thank you for that question. I mean, sometimes it's not even an argument that the Chinese data are reliable. It's almost a fact. I mean, if you look at the national numbers, for example, China just released its GDP for the fourth quarter earlier this month, 6.9%, and that invited a lot of suspicion, especially from the Western media. But the reason for that is, if you look at the figures released by the national government on the total economic output of the country, and then if you add up all the economic output of the provinces and cities, it almost always go over the national number. That's number one. And number two, if you the Chinese government tried to smooth out the growth trajectory. So that's why if you compare the Chinese growth, the GDP growth numbers with the ones from other countries, there's less kinks, there's less up and downs. If you understand economic development, always goes through ups and downs, right? But in the Chinese picture, it's always smoother if you compare to other countries. Not only they try to overstate a little bit in the bad times, they try to understate it a little bit in the good times as well. We actually, Satyajit, I, and a few other Columbia professors went to, Tianjin city, one of the four municipalities in China. The mayor of the Tianjin Binhai district told us in person that they had, in 2016, 1 trillion RMB as their total economic output, which accounts for 53% of the city's total. And just last week, they revised that figure. Now it's only 660 billion. It's a 30% correction. Something just disappeared, and this is after a very wide correction called for by the central government. So there's that data issue, and that's why we had that sort of built in our weighting system to account for that specifically. But I think overall the country is improving in that in terms of data availability and data accuracy. It's not like the government's actually deliberately lying. Things are changing just so fast, and they have to constantly adjusting their statistical techniques in terms of collecting and compiling the data.
And I would say that that's where the 22 indicators are actually quite useful, because the indicators where you have the smoothing tend to be those heavily followed ones like GDP growth. We see the same issue with companies because it's very common for companies to report steady EPS growth. But if you look at all the other ESG metrics, they're all over the place because they're not worth managing the perception in quite the same way. So you actually learn a lot more from the range of metrics. Listen, I know that there are a few other questions out there, but we have a reception planned and we're all going to be around, so you'll be able to ask your questions in more intimate surroundings. I just would like to have a round of applause for our guests.